I'm going to get us rolling if you don't mind. Good morning, everyone. Do we have Mike here? Good morning, everyone. If you can quickly grab a seat, we'll get started. Thanks, and welcome to our first educational session at this year's conference. My name is Chris O'Connell, and I'm the board rep on the CCMTA board for the province of New Brunswick. And I will be your moderator for today's session. I think the presentation will last approximately an hour. We're going to allow for about 10 minutes of questions at the end. And so if you could hold to the end. I think if our guest speaker says anything that may spark an immediate response, please stand up and we'll pass the mic out and you can ask a question at that point. The name of the presentation for this session is Earning Trust for Automated Driving. And you may have heard something about these things called automated vehicles. They're rather new. We're very fortunate, though, to have with us today Bryant Walker-Smith. He's an assistant professor in law and engineering from the University of South Carolina with additional affiliations at Stanford University and the University of Michigan. He's trained as a lawyer and an engineer, and he advises cities, states, countries, and even the United Nations on emerging transport technologies. He co-authored the Global Influential Levels of Driving Automation, drafted the leading model law for automated driving in the United States, and taught the first legal courses dedicated to automated driving, hyperloops, and flying taxis. I'm very interested about that, the flying taxi part. His students are developing best practices for regulating scooters, and he's writing on what it means to be a trustworthy company. So I'll turn the floor over to Bryant.
Thank you, Chris. Well, good morning. I'm so glad to see you all here, enthusiastic. As Chris said, I'm really looking forward to your questions. At the end, during my talk, if you're so moved, I'm prepared to dodge chairs if you're really moved, so we can make this interactive. I would like to start not in 2019, but at the end of the 19th century, in 1897. And tell you about a new transport technology that was rocking the world. It was the front page of newspapers. Everyone was writing and talking about it. It was going to change the way that cities were organized. It was going to change the opportunities available for women. It was going to be controversial and big, and it was going to mark the 20th century. So what transportation technology am I talking about? The car, the truck. Yes, yes, no, no. I'm actually talking about the bicycle. One of these two men was the Chicago mayor. I'll let you figure out which one. Elected because of the power of the bicyclist vote. The bicycle was going to revolutionize the 20th century until the car came along. Now, in 1897, this is what people imagined the horseless carriage was going to look like, and it got some attention, but the focus was really on the bicycle. And then, in just a matter of years, in 15 years, we went to an urban cityscape that was dominated not by the bicycle, but by the car. And the bicycle was largely forgotten as a matter of public policy until 100 years later. A little bit earlier down here. Kudos on that. And when, in that same 15 years, from the beginning of the 1900s until 1920, we also had the first powered air flight, the first commercial radio broadcast. All of these things were happening in that space that nobody predicted. Now, cars were pretty popular, but they weren't universally popular. The village of Nantucket, on the island of Nantucket, decided that they would affirmatively ban motor vehicles. And so they passed a prohibition, and the local postmaster was having none of it. So every morning, he would hitch up his car to his horse, pull it to the village limits, drive the car for the rest of his route, and on the way back, he'd repeat the process. Yeah, people always find a way, for better or for worse. And speaking of the worst, one of the reasons why people were so excited about the car when it came along is that it was hailed as the great environmental solution, as the green transportation technology of the future. Why? Why were people so thrilled about the internal combustion engine? Thank you for silently mouthing poop. Yeah. Fortunately, I'm not giving the lunch talk. So yeah, the average horse produces about 15 kilos of manure a day. In New York City, at the turn of the last century, there were 100,000 horses. You can do the math. They had to have the habit of dying, whereupon they would lose all their value and be abandoned to rot in the street. This was a mess. And so the internal combustion engine came along, and people said, nice, we've solved the pollution problem. Well done, go technology. Until it turned out that we hadn't at all. Now, even in the early 1900s, cars were quite polluting, sometimes very evidently so. The way that manufacturers would design vehicles would be to, build an axle at a certain strength and width, and then see how many people complained about the axle breaking. And if a lot of people complained, they'd make it a little thicker and a little stronger until people stopped complaining about their axles breaking. This was iterative design. The same way in 1912, 10% of automobiles made that year would just catch on fire. You'd be driving down the road, and you'd look back and say, oh, my car's on fire. And you'd get out, and you'd put out the fire, and then if you were lucky, you'd carry on 10% of vehicles, of automobiles, would just catch on fire. All right, so what lessons can we take from all of this, from our trip back into history? The first lesson is that the future is right on schedule. I promise you, 2020 is going to come January 1st. These technologies are going to come, we just don't know when. And the things that we expect the most are probably going to take a while, and it's the things that we don't even expect. The car, the AM radio, the plane, that are gonna come the fastest and surprise us the most. Second is that as regulators, policymakers, society at large, we have a choice between permission or forgiveness. How much should we require developers and innovators to affirmatively ask before they do something? And how much should we say, well, do what you want and ask for forgiveness later? The third real theme is that technologies are not a panacea. All of the bold predictions about technologies ushering in a new utopia are wrong. The reality is that the history of technology and the history of policy is one of replacing our old problems with new problems, and just really, really hoping that our new problems in aggregate are less than our old problems. And automated driving and all the related technologies are going to be much the same. And finally, just like our flaming car, everything is beta. We like to think that our new world of software is fundamentally different from the past. And in some ways it is, but in other ways, we've always been iterating technologies. And we always hope that technologies get safer and better and improved upon. Now, any technology talk needs to cite Elon Musk at least once, at least so I can get a few chairs thrown in my direction. And you may recall that when Tesla introduced their unfortunately named autopilot, they called it beta for a while, because it was always being changed, just like software is always being changed. That list there on the right are just some of the updates that Microsoft has released to Windows 10 since producing it. This is a constant evolution of our technologies. And as software meets hardware, that's only going to accelerate. So what this leads me to conclude is that we desperately need innovation. First, in automated driving technologies, and this is what everyone always talks about. When can we invent the self-driving car? When can we invent a better LiDAR or a better radar? But we also need innovation in safety assurance, ways of demonstrating and assessing the safety of these new technologies. And to achieve that, we need innovation in regulation. And these are the fields that you all deal with, I think, most intimately and most expertly. So what this means is that from a policy perspective, I actually think that we need to focus a little less on the technologies themselves and focus more on the companies that are developing and deploying these technologies. And that could be a pretty fundamental, but I think essential shift that I'll talk about a little bit more later. But first, let's start with the technologies. Yes, we should talk a little bit about the technologies. So automated driving is not one technology. You always say, well, this is a good technology. No, automated driving is a wide and diverse set of technologies, plural, applications of those technologies, business cases for those applications, various participants in those business cases, and it goes on and on. This is a very diverse field, and policymaking needs to recognize that incredible diversity, or otherwise we'll get a solution that just doesn't fit. Who has seen the levels of driving automation? Anybody? You're all familiar? All right, I'm seeing more than half of the hands. Who has actually read J3016, the 30-plus page document that defines these levels and many other terms? That is impressive. Okay, including that entire row. Go Transport Canada. Who fell asleep reading it? I apologize. Yeah. So for those of you, you can look this up. For those of you who are familiar, I have a pop quiz. Yeah, I know. Morning, the first day of your conference. So mean. All right, imagine we have an automated vehicle that is driving down a road when it comes upon a crash site. On reaching the crash, our AV stops in its lane until someone at a monitoring center 1,000 kilometers away sketches a travel path for our vehicle to follow. Using its sensors, the vehicle then follows this path. All right, so what level of automated driving is this? Who says this is level 3? Who says this is level 4? Who says, what are you talking about? Very fair. All right, so we have a slight preference for level 4, meaning implicitly you are saying that this system is capable of achieving a minimal risk condition. That is, it is capable of finding a reasonably safe stopping point without human intervention. All right. Second question, is there a remote driver? Who says yes, there is a remote driver in this scenario? Who says no, there's no remote driver? Who says remote driver, is that someone who hogs the TV? Okay, yeah. So, do you want to know the answers? Yeah, I wish I knew. So, these are really controversial questions that the experts are still debating descriptively, even normatively in a document that's supposed to be only descriptive. I think there's more of an emerging consensus that actually there is not a remote driver in this scenario because the person sketching the path is merely providing information that the automated driving system then uses as an input to determine its path, rather than actually in near real time guiding the vehicle. There's A lot of uncertainty about whether there is a minimal risk condition to make this a level 4 scenario or level 3. And this is among the people who've not just read the document, but written it. We still can't figure this out. This gets complex just for a matter of defining what the capabilities of an AV is. And there's been a lot of effort. So the drafters started off with this chart. It was black and white and boring. They said, well, that doesn't really clarify things. So maybe we'll put this little chart. And that helped, but not so much. And so we said, well, this one will clear things up for everyone. Not so much. And then, well, this one certainly will make it clear. Okay, maybe not. All right, our flow chart, our flow diagram. Surely this will allow an authoritative classification of any system. And note that this is the simplified logic flow diagram. Yeah, if the experts can't figure this out, we cannot, and we never should have expected the public to make any sense of the levels. And this is, I think, an early example of the importance of communication among regulators, developers, experts, the public. Now, I don't want to just give grief to engineers. Who's an engineer in here? Okay, I'm one too, I apologize. Any lawyers? Okay, oh, very, very nice. All right, so I want to give fair time to the lawyers too. Yeah, so in many of our US state vehicle codes, we have definitions for things like driver or drive or operate. And so very logically, one state, Maryland, but it could be any, defines drive as to drive. Great. Or to operate, or move, or be in actual physical control of a vehicle. Legislature actually had to write that. And then, helpfully, the state also statutorily defines operate as to drive. So operate means to drive, which means to drive or operate. So drive is actually broader than operate, right? Because drive is more things than operate. And yet operating is generally given a broader meaning by the courts than driving. Anyone dizzy yet? Yeah, this is an example of just how difficult any kind of foundational definitional work can be, whether it's law or technology. It's also, as a side note, I think a really poignant example of why drunk drivers mess everything up. Right? They mess up our roads and they mess up our law. Because the reason why these definitions are so convoluted is largely because courts and legislatures have struggled to make sure that intoxicated driving statutes can reach the drunk who's passed out in the passenger seat, or the person who's sitting behind the wheel and throws their keys out the door as the officer is coming up. And it's an example of how any clarity we have in theory necessarily grinds to a halt in the complexity and the tragedy of the real world. All right, so given these levels, we're a ways off from, I think, effectively communicating to the public. And so a lot of the discussion in the public has focused on some issues that I'm not sure are the most relevant. I have put in the smallest possible font I am allowed this question of who should an automated vehicle kill? Because this is not a helpful question. Ask me about it in the questions if you want, and I will go on a 5-minute diatribe, I promise you. Above that, a little more relevant, particularly since you necessarily deal with public context, and I recognize and appreciate that. Public sentiment defines really the authority that you have. Is the question of, does the public trust AVs? A question that there have been numerous surveys on. You'll see a new one every week. Do people like or trust or feel safe in driverless cars? And I'll talk about that one. Above that, getting more important is how safe is safe enough? How safe should these vehicles be? Just like we have regular conversations over how safe should our toasters be, or how safe should our mattresses be? And even more critical is how should safety be assessed? Even if we could, in theory, set this perfect level, this ideal level of safety, how would we actually demonstrate or measure or evaluate that safety? So let's talk about these somewhat more important ones a little critically. Right. First, does the public trust AVs? I don't think this is a very helpful question right now. Why? First, we're all fickle. Surveyors can get us to answer anything in any way that they want. They could get me to answer any way that they want on an area of my expertise. And so don't put a lot of stock in the surveys without a good sense of what they're actually measuring and who they're actually asking. But I think more fundamentally, marketing is yet to come. These are impressions that people have before the vast capitalist enterprise invested in getting people to buy and use these vehicles has had a chance to influence them. Before two massive industries, the automotive industry and the information technology industry, have had a chance to reach directly their potential audiences. And when that comes, you better believe that there is going to be some effective marketing going on. But third, words are not actions. You go back 15 years, lots of people said, oh, I would never use a smartphone. Today, lots of people say, oh, I would never trust Facebook, or I would never trust Google. And yet, we all carry our phones around, we all use them, and most of us are on Facebook. And so no matter what people say, ultimately when they have the chance to get some extra sleep or bill an extra hour in their car or watch more cat videos, they're going to decide to watch more cat videos. And finally, I think that we're often caught up with this myth of 100%, that unless 100% of people believe something or 100% adoption occurs, that there's nothing to deal with, that there's nothing of fundamental import. When Uber was disrupting entire industries, when it was on front pages of newspapers, it still represented less than 1% of vehicle kilometers traveled in the US, far less than 1% of registered vehicles. Today, not 100% of people even drive cars. Even believe that you should drive cars. And yet they have fundamentally transformed our world. And so even if adoption rates or popularity of these hovers at 50% forever, that's still a huge number that should drive policy. So I don't think the focus on trust in AVs is necessary or even appropriate at this point for regulators. And so the more normative question is, should the public trust the AVs? This is getting a little closer. Now, I don't know, AVs don't yet exist. People ask me, well, how many automated vehicles are on the road? None. None. When they do exist, they will be really diverse. And this is a legal or technical term of art. Here's the thing, they won't be super dangerous. That's reassuring, right? I don't want to be flippant, right? So first of all, we should be concerned about automated driving. We should be terrified about human driving. It's important to make sure that automated vehicles will be safe, will be reasonably safe. But at the point that developers are confident enough to deploy these vehicles, it is exceedingly likely that the vehicles will at least be within the realm of activities that we do in our day. That means they will be likely at least as safe as human-driven vehicles, even given some of the uncertainties that might arise. They will certainly be safer than bungee jumping. They will be safer than all sorts of things that we do every day. So from a public policy perspective, there's not a huge epidemic looming, with maybe a few potential outliers like a deliberate cybersecurity attack. But by and large, the issues that crop up will be incremental and will be addressed incrementally. So this can affect the way that we think about the regulation of the technologies, particularly when you ask, well, how safe is safe enough? And there are two ways of looking at this. The first is perspective. Before you deploy, this is the ask for permission approach. What should a developer have to show? What should a regulator have to assess before deploying an AV? And the other is retrospective, after deployment, realistically after a crash. How safe is safe enough? Now, this retrospective question is actually really easy. Retrospective safety is going to mean that the system is at least as safe as a human in the same maneuver. So if a human could avoid the crash. The AV should have avoided the crash. That the AV is at least as safe as a comparable AV. This is a standard metric that's roughly used in assessing recalls, in assessing products liability. This is really familiar. And I'll go a little further and say an AV will have to be safer than the last AV that failed, the last one that crashes. And this shifts us a little bit from the conventional mode of thinking about products as static things that are put on the market and more into the dynamic mode of software updates or even aviation, where we expect the systems that are deployed to continue getting better. So that's actually the easy answer. I don't think we have to worry all that much about the theory or even the policy of that. Prospective safety, assessing the safety ex ante, before the fact, is more difficult. And here, I expect that prospective safety will mean that we have reasonable confidence that the developer or deployer of the automated vehicle is worthy of our trust. This is a shift from talking about the trust in a product to the trustworthiness of the developer. And so I might have biased this a little, but that's my prerogative. Let me ask you a question. Who do you think drives an automated vehicle? Or who will drive an automated vehicle? What do you think? Shout out your answers. Whoever writes the algorithm. All right, so we have an individual human developer, perhaps. The engineer plugging away at the driving algorithm, perhaps a team. Who else? Any others?
The car owner.
The car owner, thank you. Yes, that is in some circles a very popular answer. Germany, there's actually a whole concept, Fahrzeugbehalter, that kind of goes to the idea of the person who either owns or just actually is control of the vehicle. Yeah. It's also the default in a lot of state laws that if you can't find a driver, you presume that the owner is the driver. Who else? The technology itself. Yeah, thank you. So this is very popular in Europe. It's also popular in Tennessee, where that state's legislature has actually given automated driving systems legal personhood. They've made robots people. Don't be like Tennessee. Tennessee's great, but in this area, don't be like Tennessee. You can't put a robot in jail. You know, a robot doesn't have a lot of assets. You can't fine them. You can't influence a robot by the threat of jail. It just doesn't really fit in this realm. But there's a lot of pressure to go that way, I think, as a matter of policy. Any other answers? Suppliers of infrastructure, yeah, for a very nicely, cohesively managed system, perhaps. Yeah. States have supplied other answers. So some of the legislation, specifically regarding testing that's been passed among US states, refers to the person who presses the go button as the driver, or the person who's sitting in the driver's seat as the driver, even if they're not doing anything that could be called driving. In fact, states have come up with more than half a dozen possible answers to this question, and there are likely to be more. I have an answer. You can probably guess that humans will not drive AVs. Computers certainly won't drive AVs in a legal sense. Companies will drive AVs. Companies that act through their human and machine agents. So I want to use an example of this, a tragic one. This is described as the first automated vehicle crash because it involved a test platform for Uber. Who's familiar with the crash in March of last year in Arizona involving a test vehicle of Uber and a pedestrian who was crossing the road? Most of you? Yeah. So this was at night. A pedestrian was crossing in a place that was not marked for crossing, but was nonetheless quite popular. Uber's test vehicle was proceeding under the speed limit toward the pedestrian. Uber's test systems recognized that there was something there, but was having difficulty confidently classifying what that was. They're saying, well, is it anything? Is it a pedestrian? Is it a bicyclist? And so the response of that system was to do nothing. Given the uncertainty about what it was, the system said, well, I'm not going to do anything. Not a great response. But the system didn't fail. It was incapable of failing because it was a test system. In fact, it was designed to not work. It was expected that it would not work. That's why it was being tested for the purposes of research and development. Now, this system was installed on a production vehicle that had separate and independent pedestrian avoidance technologies. Those technologies were disabled so that they would not interfere with the test system's operations. And all of this was being supervised by the legal driver, a Uber employee who was charged with watching the road. And the police report at least suggests, in the video, certainly suggests that the driver was not doing that and perhaps was watching TV. So all of these elements, any one of which could have prevented the crash, combined to kill someone. This was not a failure of the technology. This was certainly an abdication of responsibility by the test driver, but that was not the sole cause. This was a failure of Uber's program. This was a programmatic failure. This went not just to the design of the software or the hardware, to hiring, to training, to supervision, to the decision to put one driver in under circumstances that any human factors person could say was going to lead to distraction. To say this is a system that is capable most of the time that you'll get so comfortable until it's not, and then it won't be. That is the promise of lower-level automated driving automation technologies, and it's the promise of any test system. It will work great up until the point that it doesn't, and then it won't. And this is why I come back to the theme that companies are drivers, because the only natural conclusion in this case is that this was a programmatic failure. The company was driving this vehicle through some combination of its hardware and its software and its employees. And the failure was the company's, and that failure was tragic. So if we start with this premise that companies will drive AVs, why? Why? Well, first, AVs are only going to be as safe as their companies. Second, companies, unlike robots, are legal subjects that act through their human and machine agents. They act. And third, importantly, companies can do right even after their technologies fail. So at the point that an automated vehicle crashes, we have no reason to trust that car anymore. The point that it fails, that loss of trust is total and perhaps justified. But a company can still act in a trustworthy manner. A company can make things right, and I'll talk about the ways that they can do that. And so this is important to building ongoing trust, realizing that it needs to vest in the companies rather than specific products. So what makes a trustworthy company or a trustworthy corporate driver? First, I would argue that they share their safety philosophy. Second, they make a promise to the public. And third, they keep that promise. What do these mean? Well, first, the safety philosophy. This is a company saying, this is what we're doing. This is why we think it's reasonably safe. And this is why you can believe us. This is what we're doing. This is why we think it's reasonably safe. And this is why you can believe us. The promise to the public builds on that. The promise implicit in marketing a product, but that should be explicit, is that we market only what we reasonably believe to be safe, that we will be candid about our limitations and our failures, and when we fail, we will make it right. In the way that several developers of automated driving technology have said publicly, yeah, when our system fails, we accept that we'll be liable. Now, there's a lot of tautology there. There are a lot of legal niceties. But the headline there is, yeah, we get that this comes back to us. And how do they do that? How do they ensure that it comes back to us, the developer? By keeping the promise, by managing public expectations appropriately, by supervising the entire product life cycle from conception through to end, and by mitigating harms promptly, fully, and publicly. So this is my theory of the trustworthy company. Shares its safety philosophy, makes a promise to the public, and keeps that promise. We're already seeing some ways that this is being embraced or already reflected in public discussion. So the first item of note, and one that several people in this room have actually been involved with, is the Automated Operation of Vehicles Act. This is a model law for U.S. states developed by the Uniform Law Commission, which has had some tremendous successes, some tremendous failures. We'll see where this ends up. Relies in part on the very good work of AMVA in the U.S. And a key part of this model state law, I should say this model state law, by the way, is likely to be finalized in Alaska later this summer. So I invite you all up north to visit the US. I just love saying that when I'm not in Detroit. Come up and help finalize it, because a key part of this is a concept called the automated driving provider. An automated driving provider is an entity that self-identifies to a state government. They raise their hand and say, yep, I am the automated driving provider, the ADP for this vehicle. In doing so, they represent that the automated vehicle is capable of complying with that state's vehicle code. And the ADP acts as the legal driver from the start of automated operation until a human driver intentionally terminates that automated operation. So once you're the driver unless and until a human says, nope, it's definitely going to be me. This is important because we want to keep it simple. All those hierarchies and taxonomies notwithstanding, either you are intentionally driving or you are not driving. Why? It goes back to this notion of responsibility, because when everyone is responsible, no one is responsible. When the human safety driver points to the system and says, well, I thought that was going to detect the pedestrian. When the developers of the test system say, well, no, it's a test system. That's why we have you, human driver, in the vehicle. Then we're going to get in not just legal complexity, but we're really going to get into fundamental safety concerns. So there are a lot of complementary approaches as well. The levels of automation are fundamentally a promise to the public. The UK Law Commissions and the Australian National Transport Commission have each come up with a concept called the Automated Driving System Entity, ATSI, which is essentially the same as the Automated Driving Provider, but easier to pronounce. And the safety assessments that were initially proposed by our US National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and then really eloquently and expertly developed by Transport Canada, also embrace this concept of recognizing that there needs to be an entity that vouches publicly in important ways about the safety of their system, not just at one time, but over the lifetime of that safety. And I say expertly because, unfortunately, NHTSA has said, hey, developers, it'd be really great if you told us something. And many of them have in the form of glossy brochures. And as I'll mention, I think the value that Transport Canada has really brought is a much more structured and critical approach to evaluating, challenging, comparing, and really building upon that framework. And this is important because safety is not just a single test. It's not going to be, it can't be a driver's test where we say, hey, automated driving system, you made a left turn against traffic. Great, you must be safe. We make all sorts of assumptions about humans. If a human recognizes a stop sign, they can probably recognize a yield sign. That just doesn't hold with an automated vehicle. And so safety needs to extend from everything from management philosophy to design philosophy to hiring and supervision to evaluation and integration of standards, including the rejection of standards that just don't fit, to monitoring and updating, to communication and disclosure, to having a strategy for obsolescence when all these fun, new, great technologies turn out to be out of date really fast. That's just a small part of what a broad safety philosophy needs to encompass. I think about safety not as a wedding, but as a marriage. Not where a company gets up and makes a bunch of vows and promises, and it's official, and you get a stamp, and you say, all right, it'll be happily ever after. But rather is the hard work of marriage, where every day, in a practical sense, safety is being tested and evaluated and built, and trust is being earned. So when AV developers necessarily vow that their systems are safe, because responsible developers are not going to put out a system that they believe is unsafe. There are going to be so many internal checks and processes and decisions prior to deployment that the AV developer is going to be able to confidently say that we expect that our system is safe. The question is, do we trust those internal systems? Do we trust those companies? Will we trust them when they make those kind of statements? Will we trust them in the future? And what is the basis for that trust? I think that regulators can do this really well, in part because regulators are used to having courts do the same thing to them. To ask, well, your decision, is that supported by substantial evidence? Is that a reasonable decision? Does it follow from the facts? Are you providing enough evidence? Are you missing an important part of the problem? This is a standard part of what agencies deal with in making their own decisions. I think this will require a focus on processes and systems, including the kind of experts who might not be the best in computer vision, but can understand the way that a system acts. Hackers in a broad sense, who can ask the difficult questions, can identify the gaps or the omissions, the things that don't quite sit right, and are willing to play with evidence. This requires the identification of assumptions, to say, well, what assumption are you making there? What makes you think that that test accurately captures this measure that you're trying to share? And logical progressions. Are you really showing that X necessarily leads to Y? And finally, it requires asking questions and then challenging answers. Follow-up and follow-up and follow-up. Providing a forum where not just regulators, but public, other experts, even competitors, even people who want to sell new safety technologies are able to help ask and challenge these questions and answers. So for the representatives of the provinces and territories in the room, I recognize that safety is in partnership with federal government, with local and tribal governments. At the same time, provincial and territorial governments recognize particularly that safety is operational. Safety is not a one-time test. It's not just a driver's license. It's not just a self-certification of a manufacturer. That it's this constant process of understanding the relationship between drivers, who are whatever they may be, vehicles, roads, and continually challenging and optimizing that. So as we think about automated driving, I would encourage governments to say, what are your goals? Safety is certainly an important one. There are many other goals that are claimed to be furthered by automated driving. And it's useful to explicitly recognize those. And then to say, well, how can automated driving help or even hinder these goals? But also, how else can you achieve these goals? Automated driving is not a goal in and of itself. Automated driving is a tool. It's a means to broader policy ends. And I think when we ask how else can we achieve those goals, there'll turn out to be other low-hanging fruit that might be, in some cases, as effective as automated driving and might even help advance automated driving. For example, safety, large part a function of speed. If speed limits are actually effectively enforced, well, that might make roads safer. That may also make the introduction of automated vehicles a little bit easier because you won't have to deal with speed differentials or difficult questions about allowing non-compliance with the law. If you're interested in my 50 strategies that governments can use for automated driving, that's a paper appropriately called How Governments Can Promote Automated Driving at newlypossible.org. And finally, before we move to your very good questions or complaints, I want to just reflect on the complement to trust that we've talked about. And so I will end by quoting, depending on your preference, Voltaire or Peter Parker's uncle: "With great power comes great responsibility." What we're seeing with automated driving will be an incredible accumulation and exercise of power, and we need to ensure that there is responsibility commensurate with that. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.